I'm so excited to introduce Amanda Ripley. I read her book, High Conflict, and I'm sure, like you, I was looking for something to give me hope about, the extreme polarization and, ever, it seems, escalating conflict around the world. The election in Australia just recently kind of polarized that country. Look at what's happening in the Middle East, and just about every country seems to be dealing with polarization, and then we're dealing with it at the micro levels too. I think to some extent, COVID has affected us in ways we're not even conscious of, but it seems to have created more high conflict. And so I want to say a little bit about her here from my notes. I think you can see the same issue in families too, not just in global politics or conversations about what's happening in the world. So it used to be for many people that Thanksgiving was their favorite holiday, and now I talk to people all the time that say, I'm not going home, I just can't take those conversations. So how do we resolve this? That's really what Amanda's book is about. And that's why I invited her here. Her book, High Conflict, brought me hope, and that we can overcome this kind of heartbreaking polarization. And she's won just numerous awards for famous publications, has 2 National Magazine Awards. She understands learning. Her book, which is out there, The Smartest Kids in the World, was a New York Times bestseller. And I mentioned this to Amanda, and we'll take some time at the end for questions. So if you have questions, just post them on the app, and then my colleague Emily Malatesta will send them to me, and we'll talk about them at the end. But she taught me the communication skill that I've used the most, and it's been the most effective communication skill I've used in the last year when we did our podcast, so we're going to talk about that. And I think her presentation will bring you hope, and it'll give you strategies you can use in your personal and your professional life. So please welcome Amanda Ripley.
Good morning. Wow, I have to say, I am impressed. This is day 2 or 3 for many of you, the last day of this conference. And you're still here at 8:30 in the morning. Give yourself a round of applause. I'm impressed. I went to a conference last week, and after the second day, I was like, I had some kind of rebellion defiance thing I had to work through, where I was like, I'm not going back. Like, I'm gonna go running, and then I'm gonna have breakfast, and I was like not sure who I was hurting, you know what I mean? But it felt like I needed to express my autonomy because I didn't want to be forced into the schedule, even though I wanted to be there. It was very confusing. So anyway, I'm grateful you worked through that, if you had that at all, and are here. I have deep, learned respect for teachers who teach teachers to teach better. That is hugely intellectual, challenging, and important work. So I want to be helpful to you most of all. Because look, I don't think, unfortunately, the level of conflict we are in is likely to get worse before it gets better. All the indicators we have that predict political violence in particular are not promising. So our best option, our only option, is to get smarter about how we fight, so that at least we can sleep at night. Because the one place we can start is in our own hearts. How we hold every conflict we're in, whether it's political or whether it's interpersonal. So I want to start by telling a story. It's a story that took place a long time ago in San Francisco, before there was Silicon Valley, before there was Elon Musk, before there was Facebook, there was Charles Crocker. Charles Crocker was a railroad baron. He looked the part. He was 6'3", 300 pounds. And in the 1870s, he decided that he needed a proper mansion, as one does. So he began scouring San Francisco, looking for the perfect spot. And he found up on a hill the exact place where he wanted his mansion to be. Has anyone ever been to Nob Hill in San Francisco? So it's one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the world today. But at the time, it just had a handful of small shacks and cottages on it. So he began buying those up. He had his architect draft plans for a 12,000 square foot mansion, but there was one holdout. A German immigrant named Nicholas Young had a small cottage on this block. He also had a garden out back that he loved. He lived there with his family, and he didn't want to sell it for cheap. So the two men met to negotiate. Charles Crocker offered $6,000, which he thought was generous. That's about $150,000 in today's currency. And Nicholas Young countered at $12,000. They bickered back and forth, and eventually Charles Crocker decided to be generous and come to $9,000. Nicholas Young wouldn't budge. Soon Charles Crocker started swearing and he stormed out of the room, and then the conflict became something else. So what happened? Well, they were $3,000 apart. So Charles Crocker ended up still building his mansion, raised the rest of the block, and he built a 40-foot tall fence around Nicholas Young's cottage. I've highlighted it there for you so you can see it, and that is what it looked like. So this fence blotted out the sun, killing Nicholas Young's garden. It became known as a spite fence. Charles Crocker became the laughingstock of the San Francisco news media. The city council passed a law against spite fences, and there are actually laws on the books today all over the country against spite fences, partly for this reason. But still, neither man would budge, because it wasn't about the money anymore. Oh, by the way, guess how much the 40-foot tall fence cost? $3,000, yes. So eventually, the Young family moved, but still wouldn't sell. Eventually, Nicholas Young died, but his widow wouldn't sell. Eventually, Charles Crocker died. And 28 years after the spite fence went up, Nicholas Young's children sold the property to the estate. And finally, that fence came down. And then, because God has a sense of humor, the next year, there was an earthquake and a fire that destroyed everything. So, why am I telling you this story? Well, this is a quintessential case of what researchers call a high conflict, sometimes known as an intractable conflict or a malignant conflict. And then this is really interesting to understand because our brains operate differently, groups operate differently in high conflicts. High conflict is the kind of conflict that takes on a life of its own. It does not behave according to the normal rules of physics. Therefore, you cannot engage with it as if it is normal or healthy conflict. This, for me as a journalist, was extremely helpful to understand, and I hope it'll be helpful for you. I got obsessed with this question because I'd spent 20 years covering conflict. I'd covered terrorism and crime and abortion and, most controversial of all, education by a long shot. And so I thought I understood conflict pretty well. But the political polarization in our country made it so that I didn't know how to be useful anymore. Why continue to write stories that half the country didn't believe were true? We couldn't keep just doing the same thing, right? Only more righteously. So I started about 6 years ago following people who understand conflict intimately and trying to learn from them. What had I missed? People who work on negotiation in Northern Ireland, politicians in California, gang violence interrupters in Chicago, guerrilla fighters in Colombia's civil war, even astronauts, because it turns out there is conflict on every space mission between the humans, right? Especially the humans down on Earth in ground control and the humans up in outer space. So NASA has spent a lot of time studying conflict. And for a while, they were trying to select astronauts who would not get into conflict. And they found out, first of all, that is impossible. And second of all, it is not what we want. We need conflict. So the first lesson that I learned was the answer isn't no conflict, right? We've all been there. That is not how you get smarter and stronger as a person, as a community. We need conflict, right? To challenge each other, to be pushed. That is the fastest shortcut to transformation that I know of, period. But the kind of conflict really matters. So let me show you what I mean. Good conflict, which I like to think of in homage to what the late John Lewis used to call good trouble, right? Good conflict is the kind that we can see in the research. There's a place called the Difficult Conversations Lab at Columbia University where they study conflict between strangers who disagree about hot-button political issues. And in good conflict, questions get asked. There is frustration, there is anger, but then there's a flash of understanding or curiosity, and then back to anger. There's a difference between good conflict and high conflict, and you can see it. We've all felt it. So anger is not a problem in all the research on emotion and conflict. Anger is a useful signal. Anger means I want you to be better. Contempt is really hard to work with, isn't it? Because that means I've given up on you. And then the only option is estrangement or annihilation. So here's some of the differences. Good conflict, there can be moments of surprise. High conflict is very, very predictable. I don't know about you, when I scrolled through the headlines this morning, Jim Jordan, not elected speaker, da-da-da, oh my gosh. Like, it's so predictable, you know? It's just over and over. We're caught in this endless loop. Good conflict, there is movement. High conflict is rigid. Good conflict, there's complexity that still survives. High conflict is simple. You get the idea. The most important reason to care about this, of course, is because in high conflict, violence is much more likely. And also in high conflict, every high conflict I've ever seen, from a high conflict divorce to civil war, you end up destroying the thing you went into the fight to protect, whether it's your family or your country. It is all but guaranteed you will harm what you care most about. Usually you will mimic the behavior of your opponents without realizing it. So it's diabolical, and that's the thing we have to watch out for. So then the big mystery is, how? Why do some conflicts become high conflicts and not others, right? I mean, there were plenty of conflicts that Charles Crocker got into. Why that one? What are the tripwires that lead to high conflict? Well, it turns out they're really similar. Whether it's high conflict in Congress or high conflict in your school or in your neighborhood, there are 3 tripwires I want to share with you today. And I want to take a kind of dramatic example because sometimes it's helpful to take a dramatic example to see the more subtle distinctions, right? And I want to do it by sharing one more story with you. This is the story of Curtis Toller, who is one of the people I have learned the most from about conflict and how to get out of high conflict in particular. Curtis Toller spent 2 decades leading a very large gang on the south side of Chicago, creating, by his own account, a lot of high conflict. Now, he is an expert on interrupting high conflict, in gangs, but also in politics and other things. I've invited him twice to come speak to senior staff in Congress to help them understand what he has learned from hard, painful experience. So, to briefly summarize a long and complicated life, let me just tell you this. Curtis joined his first gang at age 9, for the same reason most of us join organizations of any kind. He was looking for protection, status, and belonging. But he really didn't get into high conflict till middle school. And how it started was started out really good. Started out, one day he was at Foster Park near his house, and he saw a boy playing basketball. But this boy looked different than anyone he'd ever seen in person. He moved with a kind of liquid grace. He looked only like the kind of basketball Curtis had seen on TV. So Curtis just assumed he was a professional ball player, but it turned out no. Benji Wilson was a senior in high school. And there was something else. Benji Wilson had his baseball hat turned to the left, which for Curtis was a sign that they were in the same gang. And for Curtis, this meant something much bigger. Because all humans, we have this thing where we experience vicarious pain and joy in our groups, right? Collective pain and joy. So Benji Wilson was a high school superstar. He was being recruited from all around the country. Everyone thought that he would be the next Michael Jordan. He didn't know Curtis, and Curtis didn't know him, but Curtis felt like he did, because they were in the same group. So every time Benji did something amazing, it felt like Curtis had done it too. Then one day, Curtis was watching the evening news with his grandfather, as he often did, and a story came on. They were saying something Curtis couldn't understand. They were saying that Benji Wilson had been shot that day outside of his high school walking with his girlfriend at lunch. They said that a 16-year-old kid named Billy Moore had been arrested. Curtis knew Billy. He was in the neighborhood. What? How could this be? The police called the shooting random and senseless. But Curtis couldn't live with that. How can any of us live with that? How could someone of such talent and ability, who made so many people feel so hopeful, be taken for no reason? So Curtis did what many of us do. He came up with a reason. He knew that Billy Moore was a gangster disciple, which was a rival gang to his own. So the weekend of Benji Wilson's funeral, Curtis didn't go to the funeral. Curtis stole his granddad's .357 Magnum revolver and began pursuing his own kind of justice. Billy Moore was locked up, so any gangster disciple would do. Thus began a long cycle, right, of revenge and retaliation and pain. Curtis himself was shot 6 different times, did 2 bids in prison. When he was 17, his mother, who was his best friend, was killed by his stepdad, and it was Curtis who found her body. And no social worker knocked on his door. So Curtis raised himself at that point and made his own way, tried to find some sense, some justice. Every time he pulled the trigger, he would see either Billy Moore, who killed his basketball hero, or his stepdad in his mind. And this went on, as you can imagine, and many, many things happened. Eventually, Curtis shifted out of high conflict. But before we get to how he did that, I want to share with you the 3 things that helped create this high conflict to begin with. And thankfully, Curtis is going to share those with us, so let's listen.
My name is Curtis Toller. What I do. Some people call me the peacemaker. I don't know where it came from, but it just kind of stuck. And I think how I really became passionate or, start doing the work is that I was always involved in conflict, either directly or indirectly. I was involved in a gang, which I'll refer to as an organization because gangs has such a negative connotation to it, and I know and I believe that everyone that's a part of a gang are not bad people, right? So I'll refer to it as an organization. So I became a part of an organization probably at around the age of 9, who were they were in a war, but we'll call it a confrontation that had been going on already for about 20 years once I became part of the organization, and then I grew through the ranks. So I inherited this 20-year confrontation and became the leader, if you will, of this confrontation, kind of by default. So I know a lot about confrontations and being a part of them and also, how to deal with them.
Okay, so already Curtis has identified the first tripwire of high conflict, which is a false dichotomy. Anytime we reduce people or groups who are complicated into just 2 realities or choices, we're at some higher risk of high conflict. It doesn't always happen, right? You need other tripwires, which we'll talk about. But one of the reasons the United States is so polarized, according to researchers who study political polarization around the world, is because we only have 2 parties. Whenever you do this, there's a trick of the mind where you start to conflate all the people and all their complexity and variation, and you start to see them as one thing, your enemy. I've done this myself, where I start making assumptions about 74 million people who voted a certain way in the last election. I mean, that is just madness, right? 74 million people who I've never met and never will meet, most of them. But your brain thinks it knows what's in their hearts. So that is where our groupishness as humans can get us into real trouble. So you want to avoid any time you split people into groups like this, you want to make them fluid, right? I mean, you know this from your classroom, right? You don't want to have people just be in the yellow reading group forever, right? You have to be able to move. But this happens in bigger conflict and in smaller conflict. And one of the most hopeful things I've seen the last few years in American politics is the introduction of ranked choice voting in some states and other things that try to scramble up those groups a little bit. It's not enough, it's not always easy, but it is one way to scramble up those groups. But let's listen, and Curtis is going to share another, maybe even more familiar trigger of high conflict.
Usually the people who have the most say-so or who are most directly involved in the conflict, they want the conflict to end, but it's the folks that surround them, the people that I call the agitators and the instigators that want to keep the conflict going, right? So me, it went from, okay, I have a real dislike or disdain, and in my mind, I had made it a hatred toward the other group, right? And so I kept on pushing that it was because of this war that was going on for 20 or 30 plus years. But then it also began to be that I don't want them to come on my territory to start selling narcotics. And, you know, either I was doing it consciously or subconsciously. Sometimes I wanted the conflict to continue because it gave me the opportunity to show how much power I actually had, or thought I had, if that made sense. Like, as long as the conflict was going on, a lot of conflicts sometimes are internal. And I had an internal conflict that I was dealing with that caused a lot of external conflict. So once I was able to deal with the internal, then a lot of the external conflicts just stopped happening. It was just from being physically abused, and being able to deal with that. But it takes help with dealing with some of those internal conflicts, and sometimes we don't want to get the help that's actually needed. And that's, you know, what I tell a lot of the young men and women that I work with who are in these external conflicts, that in order to really stop that external conflict, it's a lot of internal conflicts that you need to deal with.
Okay, so when Curtis talks about the agitators, he's talking about something we'd call the conflict entrepreneurs, right? These are people or companies who exploit conflict for their own ends, who keep the conflict going, who delight in every twist and turn the conflict takes. This should be familiar, right? We've now created a bunch of institutions and social media platforms to incentivize and glorify and celebrate and reward conflict entrepreneurs. Every day as a journalist, I just wake up and try not to be one, because it is very easy to be one. I have done it. I'm not proud of it. On Twitter, right? It's encouraged. But usually conflict entrepreneurs who really do it year after year, it's because they have some pain that they're spreading around. When Curtis talked about how it felt good to know that he still had power, that he had attention. That's what we're seeing a lot of in the news. People who have their own internal pain that they haven't dealt with, and they're spreading it around. So sometimes it can help to get curious about what that is. Because they'll just go on forever, and they'll find new reasons, right? Sometimes you can dial down the conflict entrepreneurs in your life by changing your news feed or who's in your circle, and sometimes you can't, and we'll talk about that. But it's important to first identify conflict entrepreneurs.
We're working in 15 of the most violent communities here in Chicago. They've said that there's an estimation of about 2,000 different groups, which are composed of about 30 to maybe 1,000 members. A lot of the conflicts that's going on here in Chicago and across the country, especially in the urban communities, you know, I would say about 70% of the conflicts start from social media, right? From a humiliation from a post which someone now feels that they're disrespected. So now they have to deal with the disrespect or the humiliation in a violent way. And, you know, it really depends on how many followers the person who humiliated you have, or how many followers you have, of how bad the humiliation is, right? And so, yeah, it's a big thing, and it plays a major part in a lot of the conflicts that I deal with. something that we use here in Chicago a lot. We call them non-aggression agreements, where the two sides are not in a peace treaty. Some people may still get shot, but there's rules to engagement. And so whether it's we won't go on each other's side of town, or if we see you with your mother or your child, we'll give you a pass. And hopefully those minor steps can turn into major steps. The more time and the more distance and the more things that can happen in between the conflict or during the conflict makes it more easier to come to a resolution.
So Curtis is starting to talk there about ways out of conflict with the Non-Aggression Pact, which I want to get back to. But before we do, the third and last trigger I want to talk about, the tripwire you want to watch out for if you want to avoid high conflict, is humiliation. This is probably the most underappreciated force driving every conflict I've ever seen, including, as I just mentioned, the House Speaker debate. And yet we rarely talk about it, right? So humiliation is the forced and public degradation, an unjustified loss of dignity, pride, or status. For Curtis, when Benji Wilson got killed, it felt humiliating. His first thought, he remembers as a boy, hearing the news that Benji had died, was, who else do we have? His group was up on high, and now it was brought low in his mind. Nelson Mandela has the best quote I've ever heard about humiliation. He said, "There is no one more dangerous than one who's been humiliated, even when you humiliate him rightly." So it's important to keep in mind. And how do we avoid humiliating people? Well, sometimes you can't, because you didn't mean it that way and they took it that way. Sometimes conflict entrepreneurs frame everything as a humiliation. If you listen to Putin's speech before the invasion of Ukraine, it's laced through with allegations of humiliation. So these things interact, right? Conflict entrepreneurs, false dichotomies, humiliation. But sometimes you can avoid humiliating someone by just removing the audience, right? All of you who have taught teenagers probably know this. It's best not to go up against a teenager in front of the whole class, right? But the same is true with adults. It can be a conflict that can stay healthy if there's not an audience. Okay, so I want to go through a few of the things that Curtis taught me and that other people have taught me about how to get out of high conflict. Some of the things obviously don't apply because they're about gang violence, and I'm not suggesting that education is like gang violence. Not saying it's not, but there are differences, obviously. Curtis got a lot of trauma counseling, which was very important and a big part of the program that he runs now with Arnie Duncan in Chicago Cred, where they do trauma counseling as part of everything else they do with people who are trying to get out of violence. But also, the first thing everyone does who's ever gotten out of high conflict that I've ever looked at is identify the conflict entrepreneurs in their midst and try not to be one. So think about who is ginning up more and more conflict. And if you can't distance yourself from this person or this organization or company, because sometimes you can't, then you got to do the opposite of what you want to do. That's the trick of high conflict. You got to spend a little more time with the conflict entrepreneurs, a lot less. You got to try to understand them. If they're 80% conflict entrepreneur, can you speak to the 20%? What else do they care about? So when Curtis talked about that non-aggression agreement, which is what I'm hopeful that our politicians will eventually do in the United States, they're coming up with things that are off limits, right? And so some of that is just creating guardrails and norms where there aren't any anymore. And that's one way to manage conflict entrepreneurs, is to figure out what else do they want in addition to the conflict. There's usually something else. Often people are most worried about their own kids. So that's one way in. And that's actually how Curtis left high conflict. He was at his son's 8th grade graduation in Chicago, and all of a sudden he just started weeping, which he was not prone to do typically. He knew that he was either going to get sent to prison soon or killed. And his identity as a father was competing with his identity as a gang leader. And he reached what we call a saturation point, which can happen in conflicts, where there's something that just gets to a point where you feel like the losses outweigh the gains, and you start asking yourself big questions. And thank God there were people who invited him out, because often people reach a saturation point and they've got nowhere to go, so they go back to the conflict. Which is why it's important to stay in relationship with people who are in high conflict if you can, because one day they might want to come out. The second thing is to rehumanize yourself and everyone else, which is hard to do. Anyone who's in conflict, your instinct, right, especially if you're a leader, is to kind of wall up, to never let them see you sweat, to act like a robot, which makes you much easier to dehumanize. So again, we see this pattern where in high conflict, you have to do the opposite of what your intuition tells you to do, which is hard. But you have to show a little bit of vulnerability within reason and act like a human. And that is something that Curtis got very good at doing, as you could hear. And the last thing I want to share is this idea of the magic ratio, which got very out of whack during the pandemic. John and Julie Gottman, who study marital conflict at the Love Lab in Seattle, as well as others who study political conflict, have found that you need a ratio of about 5 to 1. We have any math teachers in the room? Yeah, so I love this. I love ratios. Okay, so 5 to 1. I have to admit, it was higher than I expected. 5 feels like a lot, but 5 positive interactions, even real quick fleeting things, for every 1 negative, and then you're more likely to stay in good conflict instead of high conflict. So you got to create a buffer. This is what astronauts have learned. So, you know, they will do things to celebrate small wins, to celebrate each other, to have fun, so that when the inevitable conflict arises, they're more likely to keep it in the useful zone. In the case of Curtis, one day he ran into Billy Moore on his way to Friday prayers. Curtis is Muslim, and he recognized him. Billy had been in prison for shooting Curtis's basketball hero. He'd been in prison for 19 years when Curtis saw him. This guy that he had wanted to kill for 19 years. But because of all the work that Curtis had done to get out of high conflict, he walked up to Billy and he introduced himself. And he said, "Man, you know I wanted to kill you?" And Billy said, "Did you think I was just going to let you?" And Billy said, "Can I tell you what happened?" Curtis said, "All right, I guess." And the two men spent 2 hours talking about what really happened that day. And as Curtis listened to Billy, he felt a pit in his stomach, because he realized that the story he'd been telling himself about this conflict, that it was a rivalry between the Gangster Disciples and his organization, that they wanted to kill Benji, that it was a humiliation, none of that was true, which often happens in high conflict. The stories we tell ourselves in high conflict are never quite right. We make a lot of mistakes. So Billy didn't recognize Benji. He didn't know who he was. He didn't know which organization he was part of. He wasn't wearing a baseball hat turned to the side. What happened was he walked by him, and according to Billy, Benji shoved him out of the way. And Billy was embarrassed. And Billy had gone that day. He'd stolen someone's gun. And he'd gone because his cousin had gotten robbed, and he was trying to fix it, and he did fix it, and there was no violence, never took the gun out. But then he got shoved by this tall kid for no reason. And there were people watching, and it was embarrassing. And so he demanded an apology, and Benji wouldn't apologize. And next thing you know, the gun's out. And this made Curtis so sad, because it was a story that he'd heard 1,000 times, a story that he could relate to, about 2 boys feeling humiliated and not knowing what to do. Today, Curtis and Billy work together at Chicago Cred. They text each other almost every day. They are friends and colleagues. Curtis spends all day, every day, building rapport, building relationship, so that he can invite people out of high conflict when they're ready. And the other day, he drove by this billboard. He couldn't believe it, took a picture and sent it to me. That's him, and it says, "Healed people can help heal people." You've all probably heard that phrase, hurt people hurt people. Well, this is the second half. And I want to end with one last image, just to prove the point that people can exit high conflict, and that in fact it is the only way that anything great ever gets done. Does anyone recognize what this is? Grace Cathedral. Nice, very nice. Are you from San Francisco? Okay, yeah. So this is Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. And do you know it is built on the exact plot of land where the spike fence once stood? So after the fire, after the earthquake, after everything, the Crocker estate donated the land, and this is what eventually was built, which is evidence that humans are wired for good conflict too. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you.